Hi everyone, thank you for listening. If you like early American or colonial American history, if you like pure history, this is the channel for you. At the end of each podcast, I provide a list of sources, both primary and scholarly secondary sources, which make these presentations ideal for college students or anyone wanting to do research. So if you like this kind of content, please hit the like button and hit the subscribe button while you're at it. In this podcast, we're going to take a look at the Townshend Acts. In 1767 and 1768, Parliament passed a series of statutes designed not only to impose new taxes and regulations on the colonies, but to restructure government in the colonies as well. These statutes or acts are collectively known as the Townshend Acts or as the Townshend Program. The colonists resented these new taxes and regulations, and opposition to them followed much the same course as it did to the Stamp Act riots, which I described in my previous podcast about the Stamp Act riots. Colonists boycotted English goods as they had done in the response to the Stamp Act, and as they did with the Stamp Act, Parliament repealed most of the taxes imposed by the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Program did much to permanently damage the relationship between the mother country and her colonies. Before we go any further, I thought it'd be a good idea to take a look at a timeline just to see where we're at. I call this particular timeline on the screen From Rejoicing to Resistance to Rebellion in Only 12 Years. If you look at the left side of the screen, you'll see the year 1763. That was the year that the British had defeated France in the French and Indian War and gained complete control of North America. Throughout the entire British Empire, there was rejoicing that France, one of England's arch-enemies, had been defeated, and England was now in sole possession of North America. The colonists particularly rejoiced, since they wouldn't have to worry about France or their Indian allies swooping down out of the north and destroying their settlements. Moving from left to right, and in this timeline, you can see that the British began enacting laws and regulations trying to impose tighter control over the colonies. The colonies were used to being left alone and governing themselves, and these acts, including the Stamp Act 1765, which we talked about earlier, and the Townshend Acts, which we're going to talk about today, which is highlighted in red, gave the colonists a great deal of animosity towards the mother country. And so all of the celebrating that had happened at the end of the French and Indian War now turned into open resistance. We saw that with the Stamp Act riots. We'll see it again today in the Townshend Acts. At this point, I think the British probably could have still salvaged the situation and not ended up with a full-scale rebellion, but they continued to press the case, and the colonists end up in full-scale rebellion. By 1775, there was open fighting between British troops and the colonial militias. And of course, by 1776, the colonies had declared their independence, giving birth to a new nation, the United States, and at that point it was too late. But you can see from this timeline how quickly things unraveled. It just unraveled really quickly, and it happened mainly because the British government decided to try and clamp down on the colonies more and regulate them more. The Townshend Program was the brainchild of Charles Townshend, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer. He was also known as Champagne Charlie, and you can see a picture of him there on the screen right now. Townshend came from a powerful and well-connected family. His brother was Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, which was a very high and prestigious post. Both Charles Townshend and Parliament still believed that the colonists should help defray the costs of the troops stationed in North America. Also, Parliament had recently reduced land taxes to help please its own constituencies and wanted the colonists to help make up the shortfall. The British troops stationed in North America costs an estimated £400,000 a year to maintain, and British officials maintain that since the troops are there to protect the colonists should help pay the cost to maintain them, although many of the colonists felt that the troops were there to keep an eye on them and possibly to oppress them, so they didn't feel like they should have to pay for that. Besides, after the embarrassing fiasco of having to repeal the Stamp Act the previous year, both Townshend and Parliament were in a mood to tax the colonies for just about any reason they could get away with. In preparing to pass these statutes, Townshend did a lot of homework. He held hearings, he issued studies, he even conferred with the famous economist Adam Smith to figure out the best way and what taxes should be imposed. After working through all these details, he reasoned that the new taxes would probably bring in between £30,000 and £40,000 a year. This wouldn't be enough to cover the cost of the British troops stationed in North America, but Townshend had something more in mind that he would rather do. He felt that this money should be used to pay royal officials and make them independent of the colonial assemblies. We've talked about this in the past. There was always conflicts between the colonial assemblies and some of the royal officials, especially the governors in the colonies, because they depended on the assemblies to vote them money for their pay. And if an assembly didn't like a governor or someone else, they might not pay them, or they might pay them less, or they might pay them in depreciating colonial paper currency, which was a constant source of friction. So Townshend was hoping the money raised by these new taxes would make royal officials independent of the pesky colonial assemblies and create a taxing system that would operate independent of the colonial assemblies in general. Townshend also had remembered that during the Stamp Act rights, the colonists objected to what they called internal taxes. They felt that internal taxes could only be voted on by their legislatures where they were represented in their colonial assemblies. So Townshend took them at their word. He did not impose any internal taxes. All of the taxes were on items that would be exported or imported into the colonies, and therefore the colonists couldn't object to they were being taxed internally. He would really get this wrong, too. He had no idea how much the sentiments in the colonies had changed since that time, as we'll see. On June 29, 1767, Parliament passed a pair of new statutes, the Revenue Act and the Commissioners of Customs Act. The Revenue Act imposed new taxes on such commodities as glass, paint, lead, paper, tea, and it allowed customs officials to use the much-hated writs of assistance, which were kind of like a general search warrant. These writs of assistance were so hated by the colonists that today in our own Constitution, the Bill of Rights prohibits these kinds of things. The search warrant today has to be specific. It has to name persons and places searched and the items being searched for. It can't just be a general search warrant that the official gets to fill in as they go. The Commissioners of Customs Act established a board of customs officials to be headquartered in Boston. They probably picked Boston because it was the rowdiest town. They were probably hoping, too, that having such a board of commissioners, just like the one they had in England to oversee tax collection there, would make the tax collection system more efficient and more accountable. Just as a side note, I think that the Customs Board, establishing it, arguably probably did more to increase animosity towards the mother country than any other part of the Townshend program. The customs officials were corrupt. They used their power to engage in petty squabbles and to get their own way, and sometimes just to make money. So they were kind of almost engaging in legalized theft and piracy to some degree. Next, on July 2nd, 1767, Parliament passed the Indemnity Act and the New York Restraining Act. The Indemnity Act reduced taxes on British East India Company tea. The colonists smuggled lots of cheap Dutch tea into the colonies, and it was hoped that by reducing taxes on British tea, the tea would be cheaper and the colonists could be induced to buy it. Plus, many British politicians had a vested interest in the company and hoped to make some money this way. The New York Restraining Act restrained the New York legislature from passing bills until it had complied with the Quartering Act. From looking at our timeline, you recall that Parliament had passed the Quartering Act in 1764, which required New York to provide living quarters and food for British soldiers, and the New Yorkers resented this, and the Assembly would not provide either for the troops. And so Parliament, tired of haggling with them, said simply that we're going to nullify your legislature, suspend it until they comply. This act sent a chill up the spines of every colonist from Georgia to New Hampshire. Englishmen had the right in their minds, it was part of their political philosophy, to be represented in a legislative body. How could Parliament simply suspend their legislative bodies or order them to do something? And since the colonists were not represented in Parliament, how could they consent to this law since they had no say in its making? I think this particular act frightened all of the colonies and probably made them work more closely together. After all, if they could do this to New York, they could do it to South Carolina or Virginia or any of the other colonies. On September 4th, 1767, Charles Townshend died, so he didn't get to see the fulfillment of his program put into operation. But there was still one other act of Parliament that was kind of hanging around and that got finished, and that was the Vice Admiralty Court Act of March 8th, 1768. There was already a Vice Admiralty Court in North America. It was in Halifax, Nova Scotia. But this act established 3 more courts, one in Boston, one in Philadelphia, and one in Charlestown in South Carolina. It was pronounced Charlestown back then. It's Charleston today. These Vice Admiralty courts had jurisdiction over customs violations, and they had no juries. It was just a judge making the decision. Townshend and other officials in London hated the fact that so often colonial jurors would not convict smugglers. Indeed, they relied on smugglers for cheap merchandise, and they didn't like the British customs officials anyway. So these Vice Admiralty courts had no juries. The judges were appointed by the king and to serve at his pleasure. which they hated. They wanted these judges to have to serve during good behavior. That's a phrase that appears in our own Constitution. This means they can't be removed by the king for whatever reason he wants, but rather only because of their own misconduct, which makes them beholden to the king. And the judges and officials of the Vice Admiralty Courts were paid out of the funds provided by the fines that were collected from their actions. So this immediately brings a certain element of corruption into it, because the judges are going to always find someone guilty and impose a fine because they get a cut of it. The reaction in the colonies to the Townshend program was very similar to their reaction to the Stamp Acts. Mobs prowled the streets and intimidated royal officials. Sometimes they interfered with the seizure of ships and actually rescued several that had been seized. The commissioners of the newly created Board of Customs in Boston were particular targets of abuse and lawsuits even. And in some cases, ships were not allowed to land or unload their cargo so that the taxes couldn't be paid on them. In New York, a full-scale brawl broke out between a mob and some soldiers that were stationed there. This battle's often been called the Battle of Golden Hill. Luckily, no one was killed, but soldiers did chase some citizens through the streets and down back alleys. Some people were injured severely by saber slashes. In modern terms, the Battle of Golden Hill occurred in New York near the intersection of Fulton and Cliff Streets, which is just a little north and west of the Brooklyn Bridge, and a little east of the Federal Hall, which is where George Washington would one day in the future take the first oath of office as president. The most serious violence occurred in Boston, however, on the night that customs officials seized one of John Hancock's ships, the Liberty. There had already been growing tensions and personal animosity between Hancock and some of the royal officials. Hancock was the militia captain, and he had failed to parade the militia out in honor of the arrival of the customs commissioners when they arrived in Boston, which was a normal thing for the militia to do when high-ranking British officials came to the colonies. Hancock also declined invitations for dinner and so forth, and in retaliation, Governor Bernard vetoed Hancock's election to the governor's council. The arrival of British warships in Boston emboldened the commissioners to be more aggressive in enforcing the laws and actually, I think, to engage in corruption and pettiness. On June 10th, they seized the Liberty, which was John Hancock's ship, on trumped-up charges that were basically technicalities. They were unable to actually seize the ship because a mob of about 500 people showed up, and so the captain of the warship, the Romney, sent a crew of Marines over who cut the lines of the Liberty and towed it safely back to next to the Romney where the mob couldn't get to it, all the meanwhile being pelted with cobblestones that the mob had ripped up from the streets and were throwing at the Marines. The captain of the Romney, a British captain, he had complete contempt for the colonists, and we'll see this over again. All British officials pretty much did that served in the colonies, but the Royal Navy especially did, and we'll see that in some future podcasts. So a short time before this riot, the captain of the Romney had actually sent press gangs ashore to kidnap colonists to force them to be in the Royal Navy. This was not a new practice. It was legal. A captain that didn't have enough men to man his ship could send guys ashore and kidnap people, able-bodied men, and force them to be in his crew, whether they wanted to or not. So this wasn't new, but it caused a riot all on its own, and a mob went down to his ship and actually rescued some of the men he had kidnapped. So there was already a lot of bitterness, and Boston was primed for violence. After Hancock's ship, the Liberty, was seized, the mob then turned its wrath upon the commissioners, the customs commissioners. One of them was caught and dragged through the streets. Rocks were thrown at him and he was abused. They eventually all escaped, rounded up their families and what cash they could find, and sought safety aboard the British warships where the mobs couldn't get to them. Massachusetts Governor Bernard, he fled in terror to Castle William. It's an island east of Boston where there's a fort. And he sent an urgent letter to General Gage requesting troops be sent to quell the rioting. Royal officials in Massachusetts were eager not to have another riot, and so they cut a backroom deal with Hancock, allowing him to take his ship if he would post a bond for it. You have to feel sorry for John Hancock a little bit. He was very wealthy. He was one of the wealthiest colonists, and it would have been natural for him to drift into the British orbit, but he never did. I think he understood that if he did, he would then be the subject of wrath and abuse by the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty's leadership, James Otis and Samuel Adams, they made sure that Hancock was given special treatment. They helped him get elected to the Massachusetts House of Representatives to keep him in their court. And apparently it worked because Hancock never did go off and side with the British. He always stayed with the Patriots. Probably saved his life, but it did make him the target of abuse by the customs officials. Down in Charlestown, South Carolina, similar events were playing out. Customs officials seized one of the ships of Henry Lawrence, who was also one of the wealthiest colonists in the colonies. The seizure was on little technicalities that normally probably would have been overlooked, and it didn't help that the judge in the case, Egerton Leigh, had married Henry Lawrence's niece, but had seduced her sister, who was living with them. Eventually, Lawrence was allowed to buy the ship back for more than it was worth, and he was charged a fee of £277 by the judge for having to hear the case. I think if things had stopped there, it probably would have simmered down, but it got worse. At about that same time, another one of Lawrence's ships was seized on another technicality, but the case was ultimately dismissed, and Lawrence sued the official, his name was Repeal, that had seized his ship and was awarded £1,400. Now, Repeal didn't have the £1,400 to pay Lawrence, so he seized another one of Lawrence's ships on another technicality, but offered to drop the charges if Lawrence would drop the $1,400 damage suit, which Lawrence refused to do. In the end, the suit was dropped, but Lawrence was charged part of the cost, which I think outraged him. And from all these activities, we get just a taste of how corrupt the customs officials could be. Now, Lawrence wasn't going to go quietly. He was quite wealthy and had the resources to fight back, and he was full of disgust over this, and he published an account of what had happened to him to try and embarrass the customs official. Egerton Leigh, the corrupt judge in the case, who had retired, fired back by writing his own pamphlet attacking Lawrence called The Man Unmasked. In turn, Lawrence sharpened his own pamphlet calling Leigh a polecat and as greedy, coarse, and filthy wretch. And he made sure that these pamphlets were circulated far and wide throughout the colonial newspapers and even into London. Probably made entertaining reading for all those that got a chance to read it. But it did leave kind of a black mark on the customs officials and how corrupt they were. We'll have a lot more to say about Henry Lawrence later. Lawrence played a big role in American independence. I want to talk now about the colonial newspapers and how they factored in. Just as with the Stamp Act riots, the newspapers, the editorials and stories that were written were very personal and bitter, and they went both ways. And they became so bitter they actually led to physical altercations. James Otis was clubbed so severely that he literally lost his senses, and leadership then passed to Samuel Adams. So it was kind of a serious business with these newspapers. Colonial governors complained bitterly about their lack of power to stop the newspapers. They couldn't really do anything about it. The British world pretty much had a freedom of the press generally in place. It was not as free as our press today is, but it was much freer than you would have found in France or Spain or any other place in the world. The way that London dealt with the newspapers was basically to leave them alone. Despite the freedom of the press, the governor of Massachusetts did try to go after the press on grounds of seditious libel, which ended up backfiring, and it started a whole new round of social discussion about free speech and freedom of the press, which is a discussion that's still around today. One writer in the Boston Gazette, which was probably the most outspoken newspaper in the colonies, wrote this. He said, "Freedom of speech is the great bulwark of liberty. They prosper and die together, and it is the terror of traitors and oppressors and a barrier against them." Another writer, this time writing in the New York Gazette, wrote, "The body politic is often sick, and a free discussion is certainly the best means of pointing out the disease, that so a suitable remedy may be applied. Attempts to prevent the liberty of the press in this province will be in vain. While there is a free press on the continent, since all causes gain ground by persecution, French, Spaniards, or Turks may bear the yoke, but true Englishmen will never yield." Another writer, writing in the Boston Gazette, decried the suspension of the New York legislature, saying, "If our legislative authority can be suspended whenever we refuse obedience to laws we never consented to, we may as well acknowledge ourselves slaves. My blood is chilled and creeps cold through my stiffened veins because of the shocking encroachment on colonial rights." But not all the newspaper articles ran one direction. There were a few newspapers and writers that criticized Patriot leaders. For example, the Boston Chronicle used epithets describing John Hancock as Johnny Dupe Esquire, and they described James Otis as Muddlehead. In one rambling article, they wrote that Hancock is a milk cow, surrounded with a crowd of people, some of whom are stroking his ears, other tickling his nose with straws, while the rest are employed in rifling his pockets. So the bitterness and personal attacks went both directions. Just as there was a newspaper war in the colonies, on the other side of the Atlantic there was also a newspaper war going on in England about what was happening in the colonies. But this war was different in both tone as well as in content. And of course, there were both critics of the colonists and supporters of the colonists. One person, using the pseudonym Old Mentor, writing in the London Chronicle, said that England should cut off all trade with the colonies so that they could show the braggarts their insignificancy in the scale of empire. Other writers made fun of John Hancock and other wealthy colonial leaders, claiming that they had stocked up before the boycott started, therefore they wouldn't be affected by them. One defender of the American colonists, writing in the London Magazine, wrote, "In short, there is such just and cogent reasoning, such a spirit of liberty breathed through the whole of the American productions at this time as would not have disgraced ancient Greece or Rome when struggling against oppression. At the same time that the authors and abettors of the present impolitic measures," he's referring to the Townshend statutes, "in England are as to argument and language even below contempt. They are absolutely taking steps against the colonies that might have been expected from our princes and their wretched ministers in the 17th century. And here the author's talking, of course, about the Stuart kings. We've already done podcasts about them. "But rather disgrace the present reign so distinguished for its blessings and its protecting the subject in the enjoyment of liberty and property." So here he is talking about King George, the present king, and his disappointment in King George's doing this to fellow Englishmen, even though they're colonists. He then went on to write, "From our own observations, we will venture to say that 9 persons in 10, even in this country, are friends to the Americans and thoroughly convinced that they have right on their side." It's interesting that this was written in the London Magazine, which was the leading periodical in London at this time, so it must have reached a lot of readers. Many writers in the English newspapers were merchants who were losing money from the boycott that the American colonists were doing of their goods. Many of these merchants worried that the Americans might begin their own manufacturing, which they weren't allowed to do, but they might just start doing it anyway if they couldn't get the things they needed from England. And so many of these merchants were encouraging the repeal of the Townshend taxes. Still, many other newspaper writers in England just made light of the whole affair in the colonies as though it was really nothing that important to them. And they even went as far as to have editions of newspapers where they were laying odds and bets on when the law would be repealed, if it would be repealed, and if it was repealed, how long it would take for the colonists to end their boycotts. One of the newspaper writers that we have to talk about is a man named John Dickinson. Dickinson was a wealthy man who lived in Pennsylvania, and he wrote a series of 12 letters that were published in the Pennsylvania Gazette and began being spread out and reprinted in other colonial newspapers. He wrote a series of 12 of these, and he simply signed them as a farmer. They became so popular for their opposition to the Townshend program that he compiled them into a pamphlet form and called them simply Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania to the Inhabitants of the British Colonies. And it was the most widely read pamphlet in the colonies until just a few years later Thomas Paine would write Common Sense just on the eve of the American Revolution. Dickinson was no radical like Samuel Adams. He was proud to be part of the British Empire, and he acknowledged Parliament's unquestionable right to regulate the trade of Great Britain, including the trade of the colonies. He described the colonies as parts of the whole, and he said, "We are as much dependent on Great Britain as a perfectly free people can be on another." Dickinson's main gripe was that Britain had never attempted to tax the colonies just for the purpose of raising revenue. He argued that that had always been left to their independent assemblies within the colonies to do that. He wrote, "I have looked over every statute relating to these colonies from their first settlement to this time, and I find every one of them founded on this principle till the Stamp Act administration. All before are calculated to regulate trade and preserve or promote a mutually beneficial intercourse between the several constituent parts of the empire. And though many of them imposed duties on trade, yet those duties were always imposed with design to restrain the commerce of one part that was injurious to another, and thus to promote the general welfare. The raising of revenue thereby was never intended. Never did the British Parliament, till the period above mentioned, think of imposing duties on America for the purpose of raising a revenue." So Dickinson had changed the constitutional issue a little bit. During the Stamp Act, the colonists claimed that they were objecting because the British were attempting to raise an internal tax on them, and their assemblies had not consented. Dickinson broadened that and just simply said, "We've never been taxed for the purpose of raising a revenue. That authority is lodged in our assemblies, not in the British Parliament." But he didn't object to Parliament regulating trade. He didn't object to Parliament being the supreme power in the empire or anything like that. I think it's interesting that Dickinson used the phrase general welfare. That exact same phrase appears in our Constitution and its meaning has been much debated. Dickinson also went on to talk about how much he feared the subtlety of encroachments of government power. He wrote, "Thus the Caesars ruined the Roman liberty under the titles of tribunical and dictatorial authorities, old and venerable dignities known in the most flourishing times of freedom. In imitation of the same policy, James II, when he meant to establish popery, meaning the Catholic Church in England, talked of liberty of conscience, the most sacred of all liberties, and had thereby almost deceived the dissenters into destruction. All artful rulers who strive to extend their power beyond its just limits endeavor to give to their attempts as much semblance of legality as possible. Those who succeed them may venture to go a little further, for each new encroachment will be strengthened by a former. That which is now supported by examples growing old will become an example itself, and thus support fresh usurpations." So he's talking about how sometimes government officials and kings and emperors will do little subtle things in the name of protecting people when at the same time actually encroaching and gaining power by doing so. And he gave examples from ancient Rome as well as from England with James II. And then he wraps it all up with this really insightful comment. He says, "A free people, therefore, can never be too quick in observing, nor too firm in opposing the beginnings of alteration either in form or reality, respecting institutions formed for their security." Dickinson went on in one place to call out to the people of Great Britain that they should be concerned with these usurpations. I think it's implied that these same usurpations being inflicted on the colonies could then be applied to them. He went on to say, "True it is that if the people of Great Britain were not too much blinded by the passions that they have been artfully excited in their breasts against their dutiful children, the colonists, these considerations would be nearly as alarming to them as to us." Personally, I wish that Dickinson's writings were required reading in high schools and in colleges. There's a lot of good material there about the feelings about government that they had and the distrust of people with power, and I think it would be very beneficial for most Americans to read. Apparently, Dickinson's letters made quite an impact because even the governor of faraway Georgia, Governor Wright, complained of the inflammatory publications from the northward, particularly that Mr. Farmer, who had most plentifully sown his seeds of faction and sedition, to say no worse. On February 11, 1768, the Massachusetts House of Representatives issued a report that they sent out as a circular letter to the other colonial assemblies for approval and support. The circular letter acknowledges the supremacy of Parliament, but it also went on to conclude that since the colonists were not represented in Parliament, they had no authority to enact the Townshend program, because that would deprive them of their right to property without them having a say in the law, and that it was the right of all Englishmen to be represented in the legislative process, and therefore the Townshend program was unconstitutional. That's the gist of the circular letter. There's a lot more to it, and it was pretty much echoing what was being said in the newspapers. When news of the circular letter reached London, Lord Hillsborough, who was the person immediately in charge of supervising the colonies, wrote his own response, which was pretty arrogant and heavy-handed. It probably did nothing but inflame the colonies even more. He ordered the governor of Massachusetts to order the House of Representatives to rescind the circular order, and the Massachusetts House of Representatives would not. In fact, the vote was 92 in favor of keeping it to 17 who wanted to rescind it. And thereafter, the 92 were always celebrated as, quote, the glorious 92. Toasts were drunk in their name. Lord Hillsborough also went on to warn any other colonial governors that they should not allow any of their assemblies to buy into the circular letter, and that if any of them approved it, they were to be dissolved immediately. He also even went on to encourage the governors, if need be, to use the old Treason Act, which had been passed in the time of Henry VIII 200 years earlier, to send offenders to England for trial if they were involved in treasonous activity. And of course, that alone inflamed colonial sentiments too. By the end of 1768, most colonial assemblies had endorsed the circular letter and were dissolved for doing so. Also, by the end of 1768, British troops had been moved into Boston, and I think it's safe to say that at this point, the colonies were a powder keg about to erupt. I want to talk now about the concept of virtual representation. Virtual representation was a political theory that some British politicians used to counter the colonial argument that because the colonists were not represented in Parliament, that Parliament's actions in the Townshend program were unconstitutional because they weren't represented there. The theory of virtual representation said that even though not every person within the British Empire gets to vote for a representative, all the interests of the empire are represented in Parliament, and therefore it's not unconstitutional if you don't get to actually vote for a member of Parliament. Politicians that promoted the idea of virtual representation pointed out the fact that in England, not all parts of England were represented fairly. Many parts of England had almost no representation in Parliament, while others had more than they should have. It wasn't apportioned fairly, like it is basically today in the U.S. House of Representatives. I kind of think this argument was stupid because all it did was point out the corruption in how Parliament was elected and probably reduced the respect the colonists had for it as an institution. I don't think it was a very effective theory or argument to use. In the end, the British Parliament ended up repealing the Townshend duties, and this came about pretty much in the same way as it had during the Stamp Act. The boycotts and non-importation agreements that the colonists had entered into and were enforcing had a detrimental effect upon the financial affairs of many British merchants who then pressured Parliament and the King to end the taxes. It's interesting that even conservatives like George Washington were in favor of the boycotts and of the non-importation. In a letter written to his neighbor, George Mason, who we'll say a lot more about in future podcasts because he played an important role, especially in writing the Constitution, in a letter to George Mason from April 1769, Washington said this: "At a time when our lordly masters in Great Britain will be satisfied with nothing less than the deprivation of American freedom, it seems highly necessary that something should be done to avert the stroke and maintain the liberty which we here derived from our ancestors. But the manner of doing it to answer the purpose effectually is the point in question. Addresses to the throne and remonstrances to Parliament we have already, it is said, proved the inefficiency of. How far then our attention to our rights and privileges is to be awakened or alarmed by starving their trade and manufactures remains to be tried. Upon the whole, therefore, I think the scheme a good one, and that it ought to be tried here." And Washington here, of course, is talking about the non-importation and boycotting. And he went on to write, "With such alterations as the exigency of our circumstances render absolutely necessary, but how and in what manner to begin the work is a matter worthy of consideration." There was also some political pressure from within the British government. Not all the politicians there supported the Townshend Acts. They looked at alarm at what was happening in the colonies, thinking that perhaps they might actually be driven to rebellion or into the arms of one of the other European powers that hated the British. Lord Shelburne, for example, predicted that if the situation persisted, France or Spain would not hesitate to get involved, and he said, "the days of which they already begin to count." So clearly on his mind, he was thinking it's just a matter of time before Spain or France get involved, and it could lead to a rupture with the colonies. Ben Franklin, who always had some of the best and most insightful comments to make about things, in a letter to William Strahan, and keep in mind Franklin was living at London at this time, he answered Strahan's questions about what was happening with the colonies and the Townshend program. And this letter is from 1769. Franklin said, "The wisest counsels are liable to be misled, especially in matters remote from their inspection. At present, the colonies consent and submit to the supremacy of Parliament for the regulation of general commerce, but a submission to acts of Parliament was no part of their original constitution. Our former kings governed their colonies as they governed their dominions in France, without the participation of British parliaments." He went on to explain that having Parliament simply raise taxes in the colonies tended to render their assemblies useless. For if a revenue could be raised in the colonies for all purposes of government by act of Parliament without grants from the people there, governors who do not generally love assemblies would never call them. They would be laid aside, and when nothing should depend upon the people's goodwill to government, their rights would be trampled on, they would be treated with contempt. In another letter to Lord Kames, Franklin warned, "America, an immense territory favored by nature with all advantages of climate, soil, great navigable rivers, and lakes, must become a great country, populous and mighty, and will in a less time than is generally conceived be able to shake off shackles that may be imposed on her, and perhaps place them on the imposers." So Parliament eventually relented and did repeal the Townshend duties, or the Townshend taxes, although the other things were left in place, the customs officials, the vice admiralty courts, etc., and those continued to irritate the colonists. The repeal happened in April of 1770, ironically just a month after a violent encounter known as the Boston Massacre, which will be the subject of an upcoming podcast. Before I end this podcast, I want to mention one last important detail, and that has to do with the Declaration of Independence. If you've ever read a copy of the Declaration of Independence, you know that it contains a long list of complaints that the colonists had about King George and what he had done to them. And so much of it, almost most of those complaints, you can link back to what was going on here with the Townshend duties. For further information on this subject, I recommend the following books and articles. The Townshend Moment, The Making of Empire and Revolution in the 18th Century by Patrick Griffin. Desperate Sons, Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, John Hancock, and the Secret Bands of Radicals Who Led the Colonies to War by Les Standiford. The Revolutionary, Samuel Adams by Stacy Schiff. John Hancock, Merchant King and American Patriot by Harlow Giles Unger. George Washington, Writings, edited by John Rodahamel. The Preliminaries of the American Revolution as Seen in the English Press, 1763 through 1775, by Fred Yunkin Hinkhouse. The Long Fuse, How England Lost the American Colonies, 1760 to 1785, by Don Cook. Prelude to Independence, The Newspaper War on Britain, 1764 to 1776, by Arthur M. Schlesinger. Benjamin Franklin, Autobiography, Poor Richard, and Later Writings, edited by J. A. Leo LeMay. The Founding of a Nation, A History of the American Revolution, 1763 to 1776, by Merrill Jensen. Tracts of the American Revolution, 1763 to 1776, edited by Merrill Jensen. An Era of Non-Importation Associations, 1768 to 1773, by Glenn Curtis Smith, published in the William and Mary Quarterly, Volume 20, Number 1, January 1940. The American Board of Customs, 1767 to 1783, by Dora May Clark, published in the American Historical Review, Volume 45, Number 4, July 1940. And Charles Townshend, Architect of the Townshend Duties, by Richard J. Werther, published in the Journal of the American Revolution, January 13, 2022.